It's 2300 GMT. This is Press TV's World News. In Bahrain, there have been nationwide rallies with protesters calling for the downfall of the Al Khalifa regime. A massive march was held in Mekhsha near the capital Manama. Bahraini human rights activist Nabil Rajab led the rally. Anti-regime protesters are set to stage another massive march on Friday. Meanwhile, police have held a candlelight vigil in memory of Muhammad Ibrahim, who was killed at the hands of Saudi-backed forces in January. Meanwhile, in the village of Nabi Saleh, a huge nightly demonstration has been held with protesters expressing solidarity with Bahrain's opposition leaders. To discuss that story a bit further, we're joined with Mr. Ali Al-Ahmed, director of IGA, who's joining us now on the line from Washington. Mr. Al-Ahmed, thanks a lot for joining us now. A quick review of various media outlets can give one the impression that the Bahraini revolution has come to a standstill, yet reports coming out of the country still speak of rallies, protests, and hunger strikes being held. How do you assess the information war being waged about Bahrain?
Well, it's very clear that countries around the world their governments have stood against the people of Bahrain and their revolution. Turkey is providing arms to the Bahraini government. The U.S. is opposing the condemnation of the Bahraini monarchy in the Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia is invading. The Arab media today in Egypt, the Egyptian Military Council barred the entry of a Bahraini opposition figure. So you see, despite all of this international and regional war against the people of Bahrain. It's not only the Al Khalifa who are killing. Pakistan is providing killers and mercenaries. That those people have shown that they are continuing their revolt and their revolution despite all of this international alliance, the counter-revolution alliance against them, led by the United States and Saudi Arabia. So this is an amazing story for the history of humankind, to see such an armed and peaceful revolution continue despite all or against all odds. It's an amazing story.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Saudi Arabia there, Mr. Al-Ahmed. How significant is the hypocrisy displayed when it comes to the Saudis wanting quote-unquote intervention in a place like Syria, while they themselves are on the ground in Bahrain, as you said, effectively occupying the country as well as detaining and torturing its citizens?
It is absolutely an occupation. Saudi Arabia in Bahrain is nothing but a constitution. And I repeat, the same thing happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968 when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia and the West called it an invasion despite the fact it was under treaty. The same thing when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan under treaty and against an armed insurgency. It was called an invasion and the world stood at its feet to support the Afghan people or the Afghan armed groups against the government of Afghanistan at the time. So hypocrisy is absolutely clear here. Saudi Arabia is not only supporting the incidents in Syria and providing weapons, but also now have been found to have incited the split in Libya. The Barga province in Libya, as you know, has announced it will split from the country, basically dividing Libya into 3 areas. Saudi Arabia is supporting that division. It's supporting the breakdown of an Arab country.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for now. That was Mr. Ali Al-Ahmed, director of IGA, joining us from Washington. Mr. Al-Ahmed, as always, we appreciate your insight here at Press TV. Moving on to Russia now, that country has accused Libya of running a training center for gunmen battling the Syrian government.
We have received information that in Libya, with the support of authorities, there is a special training center for the Syrian gunmen, and people are sent to Syria to attack the legal government. This is completely unacceptable according to all legal bases. This activity is undermining stability in the Middle East.
Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin, made the accusation at the UN Security Council. Churkin said there is a special training center in Libya for Syrian gunmen and that people are sent to Syria to attack the, quote, legal government. He added that the situation is completely unacceptable and undermines stability in the Middle East. Marada movement leader Suleiman Frangia has expressed concern that a shadowy plot is behind the creation of humanitarian corridors in Syria. He has expressed alarming concerns over a, quote, dangerous plot against Lebanon in the name of humanitarian aid to the Syrian opposition. Press TV's Altaf Talal Ahmed has more on that.
Marada movement leader, Member of Parliament Suleiman Frangia expressed alarming concerns over a dangerous plot against Lebanon and the resistance under the title of humanitarian aid and support for the Syrian opposition. These concerns, he explained, are based on evidences which verify that the Lebanese-Syrian borders are indeed witnessing weaponry smuggling and are harboring fugitives of the Syrian leadership.
MP Frangi's statements are not surprising at all, as we have received definite information that confirm the intense work of radicalists who are not only providing arms and weaponry for the outlaws in Syria, but are also harboring them and providing a refuge for them to come back to after performing their terrorist attacks against the Syrian people and army.
Experts also question the Lebanese government not raising a finger to solve the issue of the radicals who have had a history of confrontation with the Lebanese armed forces, particularly in 2008, and who are now seeking to make the northern Lebanese city of Tripoli a replica of Libya's Benghazi.
The US is as usual contradicting itself in its own decisions and not following any rational standards. If this were any other place in the world, you'd find the US fighting these radicalists and so on, but because it is on the Lebanese borders and against Syria, they want to provide aid and arms. This all is a part of its scheme in implanting chaos creators to execute its agenda in the region.
The Lebanese, who have time and again repeated their support of the Syrian leadership, pledge that they will not allow their country to be a passageway for the so-called US and Arab humanitarian corridors.
As a person who has a clear view of the future of the Middle East, I definitely am aware of the need to support Syria in this time, particularly after I heard the Qatari statements aspiring for peace with Israel.
We are in support of a ceasefire in Syria. This bloodshed must stop promptly, but we know that the Syrian leadership isn't the one causing it. These outlaws who are terrorizing the Syrians are doing all this to weaken Syria, which is maybe the last Arab state along to Lebanon who still refuses peace with Israel.
Moreover, the Lebanese believe that now is the chance to pay Syria, Lebanon's sister state, back by providing the support it has always shown Lebanon, particularly in times of war since the 80s, pledging that the relation that binds the two states is not only geographical, but also historical and amicable. The people here see Frangia's concerns over a plot against Lebanon and the resistance to be in place, as they believe that some are trying to use Lebanon as a pawn in an international conspiracy against the Syrian leadership, a conspiracy which not only do they not approve of, but they see as the first stage of war against the resistance and its allies. Altaf Ahmed, Press TV, Beirut.
6 British troops serving with US-led forces in Afghanistan have been killed in an explosion there. The soldiers were on patrol when their vehicle was struck by a roadside bomb in the southern province of Helmand. The incident marks the biggest loss of life for British troops in a single attack over the past few years. So far, at least 404 British service members have been killed in Afghanistan's decade-long conflict. The Afghan army has blamed the Taliban for the attack.
As you see, Taliban placed a mine here. When the convoy of the British passed the road, the mine went off. We spent the whole night here to assist the British soldiers in evacuating their wounded soldiers and the destroyed car.
The British Prime Minister has also expressed sorrow over the incident.
Well, this is a desperately sad day for our country and desperately sad, of course, for the families concerned. It is a reminder of the huge price that we're paying for the work we're doing in Afghanistan, the sacrifice that our troops have made and continue to make.
American military doctors say the number of suicides in the U.S. Army has risen sharply since the Iraq invasion. The study says 140 U.S. Army personnel committed suicide in 2008. That is 80% higher than suicide figures in 2004. The study stresses that the jump in suicides in the U.S. Army is a result of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. According to the report, more than 1/5 of all active duty soldiers suffer some kind of mental disorder. Thousands of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed in U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. An Iraq War veteran says the U.S. government deliberately avoids paying for the treatment of soldiers suffering from war-related psychological disorders and instead saves the money to pay contractors.
You know, the politicians and the Pentagon generals, they repeat that mantra of support the troops when they're talking about defense spending and they're talking about the billions of dollars of our tax dollars that are going into the Pentagon, that are going into the war machine, that are going into the war in Afghanistan and U.S. military adventures elsewhere. But they're saying support the troops just as a way to tug on the heartstrings of the American public, who are the ones that are footing the bill of really over $700 million every single day of our tax money. But the reality is that none of that money, or a very, very small fraction of that money, actually goes to help the people that those politicians and generals are sending to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. The reality is right now in the U.S. military, if you are a soldier or a Marine or a service member with post-traumatic stress disorder and you try to get help for that post-traumatic stress disorder, you're treated like you're lying, you're treated like you're lazy, and you're essentially punished for what you've been doing. And the practice is to intentionally not diagnose soldiers with PTSD so they can save government money, so they can give it to those defense contractors.
In Germany, a strike by thousands of union members who demand higher wages has severely disrupted public services. The walkout began in the early hours of the morning. Tram, train and bus services have gone out of service, resulting in long traffic queues on motorways in the most populous state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Commuters face difficulty getting to work in Cologne and Stuttgart. Unions have failed to get their desired 6.5% pay increase during negotiations with employers.
The employers didn't put forward an offer in the first round of negotiations last week, and that is why the trade union Verdi called a strike. All colleagues have been asked to take part.
Well, the action comes after protests by union workers across Germany on Monday and Tuesday. The strikes are expected to continue throughout the country for the rest of the week. Negotiations between employers and unions are set to be resumed on March the 12th. The cost of diesel has hit a record high in the UK, and gasoline prices are rising too. Coupled with the recession, the price surge is making life difficult for many professional drivers and firms. Campaigners are calling on the British government to reduce tax on fuel, but the government plans an additional hike in the price with a rise in fuel tax later this year. Here's more.
Both diesel and petrol prices have reached new record highs in the past few weeks, with analysts predicting a further rise in oil prices as Iran's decision to halt oil exports to the EU sinks in and turmoil in the Middle East continues. Campaign groups and motoring organisations are pressuring the government to ease its tax on fuel, which makes up more than half the price paid at the fuel pumps.
All the signs are not good, and we're sort of at the bleakest time for the motorist really that we've ever seen in terms of prices at a record high. The increasing cost of motoring is becoming the biggest concern for our motorists.
Families are spending 10% of their income at the moment on fuel for their vehicles, and millions of families are struggling because of this.
The UK's economy is in dire straits, and the RAC, best known as one of the UK's biggest breakdown recovery services, says the government can promote economic growth by reducing the cost of transportation.
We were at Downing Street this morning to hand in a report that shows that by reducing and not implementing the recommended increase in tax duty, actually it will create more jobs and create more income for the economy.
Drivers and truckers have brought the country's road networks to a standstill in the past as part of protests over the government's failure to rein in the cost of fuel. And some newspapers are warning there could be more such action ahead.
Well, look at the petrol prices. It's just ridiculous, seriously.
But it is a lot of money.
Too expensive for petrol.
Fuel prices in the UK have almost doubled over the past decade. Diesel now costs around $2.2 per litre, and petrol is only slightly cheaper. Fueling up a car or any vehicle in the UK is now more expensive than ever, at a time when businesses and households can least afford it. Chancellor George Osborne will be announcing his annual budget later this month. Drivers will be hoping that at the very least he'll scrap the plan to increase fuel tax in August by a further 3 pence a litre. But campaigners are hoping for more, a reduction in the existing tax regime, which at the moment seems unlikely. Hassan Ghani, Press TV, London.
The German finance minister has warned that Greece will face a disaster if its financial system is not rescued. Wolfgang Schäuble says Greece has long failed to meet what is needed to be in the Eurozone. He added that the real causes of the problems Greece is facing are inside the country and not abroad. His comments come on the eve of a key debt deadline to unlock a new bailout for Greece. Investors have until 8 p.m. GMT on Thursday to sign up to swap their Greek government bonds for debt that pays interest at a lower rate. The debt swap is a condition for a new bailout for Greece. Without it, the country will probably default on its debts later this month. Iran's parliament speaker says the West is pursuing an adventurous approach towards Iran's nuclear energy program. He argues that Iran has never been seeking nuclear weapons, as alleged by the U.S. and its allies.
The Speaker of Iran's legislative body says that despite Iran's open door to the P5+1 talks, the West will gain nothing if it continues its previous approach towards the Islamic Republic. Speaking at an economic meeting in Tehran, Alila Rajani said that fresh talks between Iran and the P5+1 will not be fruitful if they try to get concessions by exerting pressures on Tehran.
They must know that they won't achieve anything if they continue putting pressure on Iran. Pressures will only enrage the people in the region. They have ignored the nuclear weapons of the Zionist regime and even some of our neighbors like Pakistan, only because they are allies of Western countries. But we don't have any nuclear weapons, and it's not a part of our strategy.
Larijani's remarks come at a time when Tel Aviv continuously beats the war drums against Tehran, alleging Iran of running a military nuclear program, a matter Iran categorically denies.
We're determined to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. We leave all options on the table, and containment is definitely not an option.
Speaker of the Iranian parliament also said that pressures on the Islamic Republic were a pretext to control Iran's growing influence in the Muslim world. He criticized what he called Western double standards towards Iran.
A while ago, they made up a case about Iran wanting to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in the US, and then they apprehended a drug addict and blamed it on him. Nobody would buy such a theory, but when our nuclear scientists are assassinated, they remain silent. Some Western allies in the region claim to be democracies and blame Iran on human rights issues, where women are not even allowed to drive in those countries.
Larijani said that Iran and Europe do not have any fundamental problems. He urged Europe not to fall in what he called the US and Israel's trap set to tarnish its relations with Iran. Some officials here believe that it might be the image of a new emerging regional power that has turned into a case of concern for a number of Western countries and their allies in the Middle East, and not the nuclear issue itself. Mr. Larijani said that having a peaceful nuclear energy program was an undeniable and legal right for the Islamic Republic. He said that his country would not bow to outside pressures. Amir Mehdi Kazemi, Press TV, Tehran.